Good morning and welcome to the 11th annual kickoff to Domestic Violence Awareness Month. It's so wonderful to see all of you here today, and welcome to those who are participating virtually. Glad you could make it. I'd like to recognize our board members here today. Our chair-elect, Deidre Lashley, Kelly Madewell, Treasurer Dave Reiber, Cheryl Klinger, Secretary Wendy Waters Canal, Helena Juzwe, Attorney Sam Gilley, and Amber Scott. And our supportive elected officials, Representative Brent, Representative Del Aquila, Representative Grimm, and Senator Coonsey. Virtually, Representative Galanzi, and she's not virtual anymore. She's here live in person. So we're so glad you made it here in person. Thank you so much. Representative Matthews, Senator DeMora, Representative Miranda, and Senator Antonio. I would also like to recognize Lana Hyatt, sitting in the front row today in the green. Her 29-year-old sister, Shannon, was murdered just 2 months ago by an ex-boyfriend here in Columbus. And Lana is courageously sharing her story. She was recently featured in a Columbus Dispatch article. Lana, we thank you so much during this difficult time for finding the courage to speak. Thank you. You know, it is a privilege every year for me to get up here and tell you how so very proud I am of the work being done by ODVN and our 76 member programs, the strides being made to eliminate domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse. Thank you to all the extraordinary, dedicated, and hardworking people who create the best practices, care for victims, provide training, prevention, and policy change. Because of all of your efforts, we can prevent domestic violence, and somewhere down the road, we can eliminate it. As you know, each year at the kickoff, we give a state of the state of domestic violence here in Ohio. We do get to share some bright spots, the progress we're making, and the joy and hope that the better future will come with it. We hear from victims and survivors and how things are going on the front lines. And we also give a status of legislation designed to protect victims and survivors. Today, we pray for the victims who are still in abusive situations, the ones who struggle in the aftermath of leaving, and sadly, we mourn those victims who have died. I'd like to introduce ODVN Policy Director Maria York with this year's Fatality Report.
Thank you, Bridget. Good morning, everybody. It is an honor to be here in person with you all as we reflect on the numbers and stories of lives lost to domestic violence in the last year. The data from our 8th annual Fatality Report was collected from July 1st, 2022 to June 30th, 2023. We've compiled this data through media reports and from our local programs and cross-referenced it with gun violence archives, court records, and other public information. We have collected 112 total intimate partner-related fatalities, the exact same number as the previous reporting year. This year's report reviewed demographic and racial data. 40% of all deceased victims were people of color. In all cases, including the victims who survived, 51% were victims of color. While disturbing, this sadly makes sense to us because we know from our own research and national research that people of color experience intimate partner violence at higher rates than white people. Black women especially are almost 3 times as likely to experience death as a result from domestic violence than white people. We are continuing to find disturbing trends in the cases we review. 17 victims died by strangulation or traumatic brain injury, or a combination of both, a number that nearly doubled from last year's report. The number of family annihilation cases also doubled from last year. In at least 6 cases, one parent murdered their child or children, the other parent, and another family member, such as a grandparent who lived with them in the home before taking their own life. In a number identical to last year, 22 youth and children were killed, including 5 babies. 17 of the murdered children were killed by either their parent or step-parent. In one case, a father believed his 7-year-old son was not in a safe environment after the divorce with the child's mother. but no one in the domestic court and child welfare system would listen to his concerns until it was too late. Another theme in this year's report is the prevalence of teen dating violence. At least 4 of the young lives lost were victims of teen dating violence. In one case, a 15-year-old girl was shot and killed by her 18-year-old boyfriend. In another case, an 18-year-old victim had attempted to break off the relationship after he allegedly assaulted her at his house in front of a group of their friends. And several months later, she was killed. Teenagers are at risk in dating relationships, and we must do better to recognize the danger that can exist in those relationships. Please join ODVN in mourning the lives of those who have been lost, supporting the families that have been left behind, reaching out to others who are living in fear behind closed doors, creating communities which prioritize and provide for the safety for all of its members. Next up, we will have ODVN's Assistant Deputy Director, Alicia Williamson, with a message from the front lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Every year it's always sobering to hear the number of lives lost, but there is some good news to share. We are here today to celebrate an accomplishment we are all so proud of. Thanks to your advocacy and the elected officials that we are honoring here today, our state budget includes $20 million for our domestic violence programs. It is truly amazing. For the first time, our state's 2-year budget includes meaningful, stable, flexible funding. However, it's important to remember that this new funding comes on the heels of 4 years of significant federal funding cuts. Remember just earlier this year when we asked our elected officials to make the need of domestic violence survivors a priority. We told them 1 in 3 survivors who sought shelter were turned away because of insufficient capacity. Many of the people in the seats in front of me are responsible for running domestic violence programs. They will tell you that these new funds have the potential to save lives, that they will reduce the number of survivors and children who are turned away when our programs are full. And they will help us begin to address the deficits in our services to survivors. But they will also tell you that these new funds are just only a start. We aren't finished fighting for support for domestic violence survivors. Today, we also want to celebrate Ohio's new strangulation law, which recognizes the most serious crime as a felony. Strangulation often leaves no marks or outward evidence, yet it can cause lifelong consequences for its victims. Research shows that victims who are strangled are at a much greater risk of homicide. It's been a long, long journey, but Ohio finally added a strangulation statute earlier this year, the last state in the nation to do so. Today, we applaud some of General Assembly's biggest advocates for domestic violence survivors, Senator Stephanie Kunze and Nikki Antonio, who are just our biggest advocates, who led the fight for this new law. Senators Kunze and Antonio, we thank you for your persistence. We thank you for your persistence in the face of such strong opposition. We also thank Representative Sarah Carruthers and Senator Nathan Manning, who helped us get the new law across the finish line. Our next speaker today is Paula Walters. She survived nearly a fatal strangulation back in 2006. She has spoken here in our Capitol 6 times in support of Ohio's new felony strangulation statute. Paula, we thank you for your advocacy on behalf of survivors and for joining us today to share your story with us. Paula?
My name is Paula Walters, and I live in Henry County in Northwest Ohio, where I have served as a paramedic for the last 20 years. In 2006, I survived a near fatal strangulation because a nosy neighbor saved my life. My live-in boyfriend was strangling me in the house that we shared. I thought I was going to die, but he stopped when a nosy neighbor knocked on the door. I went to the ER where I was x-rayed and given a forensic exam. I was diagnosed with contusions, basically bruises. I worked in that ER, and my abuser was an officer who visited there frequently with prisoners, so the staff knew him well. One of the first things that one of the doctors that I worked with said to me was, "He's such a nice guy. What did you do to make him so mad?" I did everything I thought I was supposed to do. I made a police report, and the grand jury charged him with felonious assault. He ended up pleading guilty to attempted aggravated menacing, a misdemeanor. Little did I know that the worsening symptoms and the medical impact of an unidentified brain injury would start appearing over the next few months and continue to impact my life to this very moment as I stand here. You see, the outcome of that horrific night was that I received a brain injury and a life sentence. What did my abuser get? Probation and a $500 fine. It took me 3 or 4 months, but I finally did leave him. I started having a lot of medical problems after that. Over the next 3 years, I racked up 4 or 5 medical diagnoses, and nobody could figure out what was wrong. I had multiple ER visits, multiple hospital stays, and I even ended up getting flown by Life Flight helicopter to the ER that I worked in because I was having what they thought was an anaphylactic reaction, because there was no rhyme or reason to what was happening. The worst part is I lost my driving privileges and wasn't allowed to work as a paramedic anymore. In a space of a year, I lost everything. And because of that, I made an attempt on my life. 3 years ago, I was accurately diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury that occurred from that 2006 event. I wonder what my life would be like today if the right people had the right knowledge, education, and awareness about brain injury from violence. It took doctors from 2006 to 2019, 13 years, 13 years to diagnose my brain injury and to treat it. I was given over a dozen different mental health and medical diagnoses, and at one point was on 22 different medications. 22. But even though my strangulation was documented well in my chart, nobody ever thought to investigate the brain injury that caused my severe problems. Finding the right people who understand the intersections of brain injury, trauma, strangulation, and domestic abuse was key. I ended up having to travel all the way to Minneapolis, Minnesota to the Neural Connection. Dr. Hennis and Dr. Reese gave me answers, treatment, and they gave me hope. I am now medicine free, back to work full time as a paramedic serving in Henry County, and I have one medical diagnosis: traumatic brain injury resulting from anoxia from a near fatal strangulation. I am a very different person than I was back in 2019. I've gotten so much better, but don't be fooled. My brain injury continues to affect my life every single day, and it will until the day I die. You have no idea how much effort it takes me to be able to do things like stand here today and appear as I do, what society calls normal, and to do the little things that you all take for granted. I used to think that my situation was unique, but now I know that there are millions of survivors with undiagnosed brain injury who are struggling with things like memory, concentration, organizing, and things that seem so basic. They often blame themselves and do as I did, lose hope. This is why I fought so hard for the strangulation law. I hope that it will help all of those who have contact with victims and survivors to become more aware and educated. Thanks to the advocacy of organizations like ODVN More and more people are talking about strangulation, its invisible injuries, and the long-term consequences, including chronic brain injury. New policies and procedures are being developed across our state. It is my hope that these conversations will help those like me who were victims before we knew what we know now and to find answers and healing. So while Ohio was the last to have a strangulation law, we are at the forefront on the effort to address brain injury and consequences from domestic violence. ODVN has done transformative work in that area and just recently launched a brain injury from violence care alliance and moved this work forward so survivors can get services and the support they need. I want to close by thanking all the legislators, advocates, and all those who have fought for this new strangulation law. I want to also thank those who work for survivors every day. It is the seeds that you plant that give us the strength to continue healing. Thank you.
Good morning. Okay, this is the call to action, folks, part. So we need to do better than that. This is some participation. So let's try it again. Good morning. All right. I'm Lisa DeGeeter. I'm policy counsel for ODVN, and I want to say thank you to Paula for sharing her story and letting everyone know that survival and recovery are possible. That's an incredibly important message because it can be overwhelming to hear all of these numbers and all of the stories and about all the work that's being done when you realize that everything we've heard this morning is just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. All of the information that has been shared today points to the prevalence of DV, and people can feel powerless in the face of this volume of violence and be left wondering what it is they can do. Good news, I'm going to tell you. We need your help. I know that Maria and I were overwhelmed when we realized how many of the cases in this year's report were in some way already involved with the justice system. 52% of the killers in this report had prior contact with the criminal justice system. 60% of the primary victims had either made reports to law enforcement, filed charges, sought protection orders, or raised their concerns in domestic relations court. Yet the responses that they received were not enough to save their lives. So we're grateful to Representatives Jeff LaRay and Kevin Miller for sponsoring House Bill 111, which would increase penalties for felony domestic violence and create a presumption of jail time for those offenses. We're grateful to Senator Nathan Manning and Nikki Antonio for sponsoring Senate Bill 100 that would prohibit installing a tracking device on someone's property without their consent. And I'm asking all of you to contact your state representatives and your state legislators and urge them to support these bills that would create new tools to hold offenders accountable. And we also thought, as we looked at the information, or at least we had hoped, that last year's record numbers around child deaths were an aberration. But as Maria stated, this year we tied that record. 22 dead children once again. One more time in Ohio, we had more than a dozen children killed by a parent, which is why when you contact your representative, we'd also like you to ask them to oppose House Bill 14, which would make equal parenting time more important than child safety. Defeating House Bill 14 is ODVN's top legislative priority. No one on our staff can remember another bill that has the potential to threaten so many children's lives. And when we report this information, we want to be comprehensive. So we include the deaths of people who've caused harm, the offenders, the perpetrators, because all of those lives lost also matter. And so we've got one more request when you're talking to your representatives, and that is to also ask them to support House Bill 231, co-sponsored by Minority Leader Allison Russo, which would improve suicide prevention efforts. including permanently funding the 988 crisis line. When we added up all of the deaths from the murder suicides in this year's report, we realized that that kind of service would have had the potential to save 49 of these 112 lives. So to make this a little easier, we've included a QR code on the back of the fatality report. If you click that link, it will take you to the policy and systems advocacy page of ODVN's website. Scroll down a bit, and on the right-hand side, you'll see a button that says Find Your Elected Officials. So if you click that and put in your address, you'll not only be able to determine who your state rep and your state senator are, but it will give you details on how to contact them. So there's another tagline in your information, and that's in the program. That QR code will take you to the Lifesaver Fund, the website for that project that we have every year. And the tagline for that effort this year is Everyone Knows Someone. And that's true. Domestic violence has in some way touched everyone here. It's critically important that we all make our voices heard on these issues. So with that said, I'm going to turn the podium back over to Bridget Mahoney to start to recognize some of the leaders in our state who are amplifying our voices, advancing our message, and most importantly, protecting our families and communities. Bridget?
Thank you, Lisa, and what a great call to action that is. As you know, each year ODVN recognizes deserving recipients for outstanding leadership. The award is named after Jim and Elsa Croucher of Monroe, Ohio, whose 18-year-old daughter, Tina, was murdered by an abusive ex-boyfriend. The Crouchers pioneered a program to teach teen dating violence in schools, and they reached 100,000 students. Their efforts culminated in the passage of the Tina Croucher Act, which mandates dating violence education in all Ohio schools. Elsa and Jim's faith, courage, resiliency, and sheer determination changed the world and left a legacy of perseverance for all of us to follow. This year, we have 2 Croucher Family Award winners for their efforts in securing additional funding for Ohio's domestic violence programs. You know the saying, perseverance pays off. Starting in 2014, we used this State House event as a platform to start calling attention to the fact that compared to neighboring states, Ohio stood alone, not having a line item in the state budget dedicated to domestic violence programs. But change was on the horizon. It took 5 years to accomplish, but ODVN staff and program people, many of whom are here today, were steadfast in the mission. We wrote about it. We talked about it. We invited legislators to visit our shelters and knocked on their office doors here in Columbus during advocacy days. We found supportive elected officials who championed our cause. We did not let up. That dedication and commitment has paid off. And today we are celebrating the line item in the state budget established in 2019 at $2 million. The next biennium budget cycle, it increased to 7.5 million. This year is the 3rd budget cycle. We held our collective breaths when we saw Attorney General Yost included in his budget our ask. We were cautiously optimistic when Governor DeWine kept that figure in his budget. And we were thrilled when the legislature stayed the course. In just 3 budget cycles, $2 to $20 million. And we're just getting started. Governor DeWine has long championed and improved services for family and children. His support for domestic violence survivors is a natural and important step because so many children benefit from our services. In 2019, Governor DeWine signed an executive order that offers new protections to employees of state government who are victims of domestic violence. The order increased protections for victims who suffer violence from an intimate partner in a dating relationship. And the governor, heeding our call for increased funding for DV programs, included $20 million in his budget. Accepting the award on the governor's behalf is Director Annette Chambers Smith of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections.
I'm pleased to be here today on behalf of Governor DeWine to accept this award. I know that it's something near and dear to him. He wants health care and housing for the survivors. I appreciate you for telling your story. It's exactly what all of us need to know in order to continue to support these efforts. Governor DeWine has more than 40 years, a veritable lifetime of public service, and he started as a prosecutor. While he was a prosecutor, he made it a point to meet with the survivors of the people that he was prosecuting. And from that time on, he's used his pulpit to move forward with these initiatives and was pleased to support Mr. Yost and the legislature in putting $20 million in the budget. Thank you for the award.
Ohio's Attorney General Dave Yost has long been a champion against domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. His office recently led a successful statewide human trafficking crackdown. Operation Buyer's Remorse arrested 160 people who were trying to buy sex. Law enforcement officers also interviewed 104 survivors of human trafficking. They were provided services from healthcare and social service organizations. As Ohio's top attorney general, Yost also called on lawmakers to finally pass that bill to make strangulation a felony crime. As you know, the Attorney General's office disperses the federal VOCA funds, so he is fully aware of how dire the situation always is in getting that stable, secure funding for DV programs. With great appreciation, ODVN honors AG Yost today for his leadership in helping to secure that $20 million in the line item.
It's an honor to be with you again today. And Paula, your courage inspires me. I'm glad that you're doing better. What a long journey. You know, advocating on behalf of funding for survivors of domestic violence isn't very hard if you've had to sit and try to answer the question of a survivor, what am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? You know, among the curious conceits of modern political leaders is that they give a voice to the voiceless. I suppose if you look far enough back in the record, you can find me uttering similar nonsense. But you see, it's not true. Nobody gives someone else a voice. I've met thousands of survivors during my lifetime, and every single one of them already had a voice. The survivor's challenge is not that they have no voice, it's that no one cares to listen. Advocacy starts with stopping long enough to listen to that voice, a voice that's often for good reason afraid, a voice that is many times very small because of the piles of evidence that no one will hear, much less care. Advocacy means amplifying that beautiful voice, a voice that already exists, strengthening it with the practical good of shelter and transportation and treatment means gently breathing oxygen onto that tiny flickering flame with compassion and time. Advocacy means using your own key card to access the corridors of power and to make the decision makers listen to that voice. I'm blessed to serve for a little while as the Attorney General of this beautiful state. That job comes with a big microphone and with a duty to protect. But the truth is that the Attorney General is one person. A hard work of advocacy is carried out day after day by the people who have devoted their lives to it. A few of them are with me here today, and I'd like to ask Michael Sheeline to come up with our crew. Michael, where are you? Come on up here. Misha, Rachel Young, please come up. There are many more in the Attorney General's office and many, many more across the state. Some of them are here in this room who carry out that work, that advocacy. That's the real work. So on behalf of this team, on behalf of this team, I humbly accept this award. Thank you.
Next up, our Executive Director, the fabulous Mary O'Doherty.
Good morning, everyone. So Bridget told you about our executive branch champions. Well, now we'd like to recognize some of our heroes in the legislature. Before Nathan Manning became a legislator, he served on the board of directors of Genesis House, our program in Lorain County. I know that because the very first time I met him, it was the very first thing he said to me. It was when I was introduced to him in his Senate office. The second thing he said was that he was a former prosecutor and that he had seen firsthand the heavy price paid by domestic violence survivors and their communities. Needless to say, Senator Manning has carried that experience to the State House. As chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Manning was responsible for shepherding Senate Bill 288, a major criminal justice reform bill signed into law in January. The bill included Ohio's new, much celebrated strangulation law, which you've already heard a lot about today. Senator Manning also sponsored Senate Bill 100, which prohibits tracking devices from being installed without consent, a bill we did not hesitate to support. That bill has cleared the Senate, and we are optimistic about its chances in the House. Of course, it goes without saying that we counted Senator Manning as a key supporter of increased state support for our DV programs. With great appreciation, Senator Manning, please accept our 2023 Leadership in Policy Award.
Thank you so much, Mary. Certainly don't feel I'm worthy of this great honor. As she mentioned, I was a municipal court prosecutor, which unfortunately I didn't realize how serious and rampant domestic violence was in our community. And when I started prosecuting at the community court level, misdemeanors, unfortunately, the most serious thing I had to deal with and prosecute was domestic violence. And unfortunately, many strangulation cases that didn't make it as a serious physical harm standard that we had prior to 288. So, Senate Bill 288 had a lot of great things in it, but I think the strangulation language is something I'm most proud of. And when I heard I was getting honored for this. My first phone call went to Senator Coonsey and Antonio, making sure I know they've won this award previously because they certainly deserve all the credit on this. I was just happy to try to help shepherd it through. I certainly want to give a big shout out to Lou Tobin and Blaze Catter. Lou's head of the Prosecutors Association, and Blaze was head of the defense bar. Getting them on board, lock them in a room and, having them work on the details, the words, of the actual bill made a huge difference. Getting them united really was what, made it possible to get this bill through. And I think, Paula, I mean, I can't thank you enough. I've lost track of how many times I've heard your, heroic story. What both of my House days and the Senate days, you've done an amazing job advocating for this. I hate, as you can probably tell, I hate public speaking. I hate giving testimony in committee. To be able to give testimony with your strength and share your personal story, it truly made all the difference to get this through. But there's so many people that really helped along. That was not as smooth as I planned, but there's so many people that helped along the way. Brendan in my office, my senior legislative aide. 288 was a lot of work. Strangulation was a heavy lift to get it done. He's here today. I want to thank him. Heather Plahuta, who now works for our great AG, was in my office as senior legislative aide when we started 288. That shows how long it took to get this through. And certainly Lexi Davis, she's just left the office, is now working for Senator Coonsey, so she's going to continue the advocacy for victims. So this is truly a great honor. Can't thank you enough, and truly appreciate it.
So our next honoree is someone whose voice has been heard loud and clear in the legislature and the Democratic Party. When she talks, people listen. She has been a staunch advocate for women and families, sponsoring and supporting bills like Aisha's Law, the Extreme Risk Protection Order Bill, and other bills, measures key to our mission. She's very, very busy, but last March, she took the time to speak at our Advocacy Day event. We were sinking $20 million in the state budget, and the point of the event was to get the advocates from our programs charged up for their meetings with legislators. Lita Rousseau got the job done with a dynamic speech that lit up the stage. Later that day, I was in the Rife Center and I saw her engage a group of 3 or 4 young advocates. I watched while she took the time to stop and chat, ask them about their meetings, and cheer them on, making sure they understood how important this day was for the survivors back at their shelters. Lita Rousseau has a very bright future ahead of her, and at the risk of sounding a bit self-interested, I feel sure having her in such an important leadership position is good for survivors. Lita Rousseau, on behalf of the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, it gives me great pleasure to present you with our Leadership in Policy Award.
Well, Mary, thank you so much for those very kind words. And I just want to say thank you for, number one, being here today, but also being a tireless voice for survivors, whether you run a shelter and facility, you work to advocate through services, or you are a survivor sharing your story. Thank you. And I am beyond honored to receive this award today. I think there is a lot to celebrate, and it is why we are here today, is to celebrate certainly the good things that we were able to do in this last operating budget and some of the legislative wins that we have had. And I want to make sure that we recognize those things. But I also want to talk about the things that still need to be done, because there is so much work to be done. I am thrilled that we got $20 million as a line item in the budget. But the reality is, when we look at the funding per capita, that's still 85 cents per capita. And when we look at our neighboring states, they are 2 to 3 times higher than what we are funding. So there is still so much more work to do. And that funding translates into services that are still vastly needed for our survivors. I was very lucky yesterday. I was at Lutheran Social Services Choices, and I see one of the staff members here today touring their facility. And we were talking about while their bed capacity is fantastic and they're able to work on some expansions partly due to some of the federal and state funding that has been provided, there is still the need for more. And we see that, when we look at 36% of our shelters have to turn away because they can't meet the capacity needs. Or we look at the services like transportation and support groups and other supportive services that are still needed and unmet. Or we talk about the role of the crisis center calls and the volume that continues to come in and the unmet need there because of staffing challenges and funding challenges. I love that Lisa called out a call to action for legislation to continue to support. And I'm glad to see those bills on the list. I will say I'll add a couple more there. Representative Grimm, who's one of my colleagues from the Toledo area, she's working on House Bill 143, the Ohio Safe Homes Act, which would allow victims of domestic abuse, sexual assault, and other sex-related crimes the freedom to install new locks on their units and terminate a rental lease. Or the bill that Representative Jessica Miranda has reintroduced, because this bill has been introduced in multiple general assemblies, and that is finally closing the spousal rape loophole. And that is House Bill 161, which I'm pleased to say should be out of committee next week, and we hope to see on the House floor. We are one of 11 states who has not addressed that loophole, and it is far beyond time for us to close it and address that issue. And then I will finally say, as we look at this new report, and it's always stunning because, again, I remember these are more than just numbers. These are faces forever changed by domestic violence. These are children, families torn apart by these crimes. And we cannot continue to ignore the role that guns play in the space of domestic violence, specifically access to guns by abusers. 85 of these 112 fatalities, that's 3 out of 4 of these fatalities, were due to gun violence and access to guns. And we must continue to push to address that piece of this issue and not ignore it here in the legislature, and remove easy access to guns from abusers so that they are no longer able to cause the damage and the death and the destruction that they do for families. So with that, I'm going to close and say, thank you for using your voice. And I agree with the Attorney General. We don't give you the voice. You have the voice, but we need to listen to you. And we are listening to you, but we can do better. And there is more listening that needs to be done. So continue to share your stories, continue to talk about the work that you do and the needs that you have. And I appreciate everything that you are doing to build a stronger Ohio and build stronger families here. So thank you.
Next up, for a very short minute or two, is Deidre Lashley, ODVN's new chair of the board of our directors.
Thank you, Mary. Congratulations, everyone that was honored today. It's awesome to even be in this room with you. My name is Deidre Lashley, and I'm the Executive Director of Bethany House in Toledo. For almost 40 years, Bethany House has been providing long-term transitional shelter and advocacy to survivors of domestic violence and their children in Northwest Ohio. Recently, I'm pleased to say I've taken on the honor of serving as chair of the ODVN Board of Directors. Each October, the Ohio Domestic Violence Network staff and board raise money for our Lifesaver Fund. Our staff and advocates on the front lines tap this fund to help survivors around the state with emergency expenses. You can help with this fund. There's a QR code in your program that if you would take the time, you can donate today, and just asking you to please consider making a meaningful gift before you leave today. This morning, we've heard a somber accounting of the 112 lives lost to domestic violence last year. A survivor of near fatal strangulation has shown us how this kind of injury can change a life forever. We've had the very gratifying task of honoring the elected officials who made an extraordinary $20 million financial commitment to our programs and survivors and their families. It's been a good morning, and it's been a profound year. So thank you to everyone for attending our 11th annual Domestic Violence Awareness Month event. More than 100 of you showed out to show support for the important life-saving work that every day our 76 member programs across the state are doing. So thank you again for your support. We appreciate you being here.